क्योंकि इसमें आने जो पूरा कनेक्शन इधर
Recording in progress.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين أما بعد. Alhamdulillah, this is day number 4 from this hadith Dawrah, and before we start, just a number of points is that today's lesson will be maybe slightly longer than normal, so for that reason I won't take any questions during the lesson, unless it's a question to do with, a certain point, like to maybe repeat the quote or something. That's okay. But like an extra question which is regarding something which hasn't been mentioned, then I won't take those during the lesson. The second is that in the beginning, in the first lesson, I mentioned some of the books that I used to prepare this dawrah, and I brought these books with me. So, and I've also sent a brother pictures, so if anybody, maybe he can send it out, inshallah. But the 3 books that I used, they're over here. So this is the first, called Tadween al-Sunnah by Imam Zahrani. And then this is the second, which is titled Makanat al-Sunnah by Dr. Umar al-Husayni. This is the second. Makanat al-Sunnah. They're all written. It's written in the first day I mentioned. The first day I mentioned these books. I just thought today I'll come and show you the books. And the third book is Al-Madkhal fi Tarikh al-Sunnah by Hani Faqih. So this is the third one. Inshallah, I've sent pictures of these books to the brother. Maybe he can send them out, inshallah. But this is here. If anybody wants to have a look at the books later during the break, then they can as well, inshallah. And yesterday we weren't able to finish the last point, so quickly we will just take the last point, inshallah. The last point yesterday was the compilation of Hadith by Imam al-Zuhri. And as we mentioned previously, that this was the first official documentation and compilation of Hadith. However, Umar radiallahu anh, in his time, he actually intended to also compile Hadith. Umar radiallahu anh, in his time, actually intended to compile Hadith. However, he, after thinking about it, he did not, out of fear that people will mix the Quran with Hadith. So, Umar radiallahu anh, this is narrated by Khatib Baghdadi in Taqid al-Ilm, narrated by Khatib al-Baghdadi in Taqid al-Ilm, the book that we mentioned yesterday, Capturing Knowledge, and it's also mentioned at other places as well. But he says, إِنِّي كُنْتُ أُرِيدُ أَنْ أَكْتُبَ السُّنَنِ, that I wanted to write down the Sunnah. وَإِنِّي ذَكَرْتُ قَوْمًا كَانُوا قَبْلَكُمْ كَتَبُوا كُتُبًا فَأَكْبَوْا عَلَيْهَا. But then I remembered the people and the nations before us, they wrote books and they focused on those books. وَتَرَكُوا كِتَابَ اللَّهِ, and they left off the book of Allah. وَإِنِّي وَاللَّهِ لَا أَشُوبُ كِتَابَ اللَّهِ بِشَيْءٍ أَبَدًا, and verily by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala I will not tarnish the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with anything ever. So you can see how Umar, he actually had that intention of gathering hadith, but he did not go ahead with it out of fear that
Recording in progress.
But he did not go ahead with it out of fear that people will focus more on that than the Quran. And this narration also proves that Umar saw that it was permissible to gather the hadith and to write down hadith. But then what happened later on in the time of Umar ibn Abdul Aziz. In time of Umar ibn Abdul Aziz, the Khalifa, Umar ibn Abdul Aziz, rahimahullah, who passed away in the year 101. He passed away in the year 101. So he first wrote to one of the people who were working for him in Medina, and his name was Abu Bakr ibn Muhammad ibn Amr ibn Hazm. His name was Abu Bakr ibn Muhammad ibn Amr ibn Hazm. And he wrote to him, انظر ما كان من حديث رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم فاكتب. Look at what you have from the hadith of the Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم and write it. For verily فإني خفت دروس العلم وذهاب العلماء. For verily I fear that there will be lessons or gatherings of knowledge, but the ulama will no longer be there. ولا تقبل إلا حديث النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم, and nothing except the hadith of Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم is accepted. ولتفشو العلم, and that knowledge is lost. ولتجلس حتى يعلم من لا يعلم فإن العلم لا يهلك حتى يكون سرا. Until the end of the narration, he's basically, in this narration, what he has done is that he has commanded this person, Abu Bakr, to write down hadith, because he feared that the ulama who knew the hadith, they will pass away, and people want to learn, but they don't know the hadith. And that's what at the end he says, فَإِنَّ الْعِلْمَ لَا يَهْلِكُ حَتَّى يَكُونُ سِرًّا. That knowledge does not destroy except when it becomes a secret. Meaning nobody will know, maybe apart from one or two people, but the general, nobody else would know this hadith. So that was something that Umar ibn Abdul Aziz said to one of his workers, Abu Bakr ibn Muhammad ibn Amr ibn Hazm. And then later, what he did is that he then looked at Imam al-Zuhri. And Imam al-Zuhri, his name was Muhammad ibn Shihab al-Zuhri. Muhammad ibn Shihab al-Zuhri. And he's famously known as Imam al-Zuhri, who passed away in the year 124. So, and he knew the high station of Imam al-Zuhri when it came to hadith. And he said he was actually from the time of the Tabi'een, one of the few who wouldn't really write down much hadith because of how strong his knowledge was and how strong his memory was. So he actually turned to Imam al-Zuhri. And now the previous one, yes, he told Abu Bakr ibn Hazm to write down hadith, but it was, just one person, and he wasn't, he wasn't maybe on the level of Imam al-Zuhri. So, nothing much really came about of that. But then when he turned to Imam al-Zuhri, he commanded him to gather all of the ahadith. And Imam al-Zuhri, he says, أمرنا عمر ibn Abdul Aziz. Umar ibn Abdul Aziz, he commanded us. Umar ibn Abdul Aziz commanded us بجمع السنن, to compile all of the sunnah, to compile all of the sunnah. فكتبناها دفترا. So we wrote it.
Recording in progress.
So we wrote it book after book. فبعث إلى كل أرض له عليها سلطان دفترا. And then each book, we would send it to the leader of each city or province. So the Sultan, the leader of each city and province. So what Imam al-Zuhri did, he got basically all of the ulama together, whoever knew a hadith and wherever he could find hadith, and he gathered all of them together. And once he had compiled it and gathered it, then he sent that book out and a copy of that to each of the sultans, each of the leaders of each city. And we talked about also why some of the Imams previously, like Imam Suyuti, Ibn Hajar and others, said that the first one to write hadith was Imam Zuhri, because now it wasn't a small thing that one person's doing himself. Now because the Khalifa commanded him, so it's like an official job that he is doing now. And also because of his high status in hadith, he was able to gather a lot more hadith than others. However, I tried to find out if this exact book that he compiled, if it's available, or how many hadith were in there, and I couldn't find. And one of another student who was in the faculty of hadith, I asked him, and he said it's unknown. It is unknown. This book regarding Imam Zuhri is unknown regarding how much hadith is in there, and it's not available for us at this moment. So basically, it's become one of those Islamic books which have become lost. However, as we mentioned, most, if not all, of the hadith that were written during the first century, they have been added into the bigger books later on. So even if you don't find these books, then majority of the hadith, if not all of them, are available in the books which have been written after that. So with that, we move on to the notes, day number 4. And now today's lesson is going to be focused a bit more on the books. And as you can see, the topics to be covered is a bit more than normal. So the topics to be covered, firstly, a small introduction to the 2nd century. We have now finished the 1st century. So the time of the Prophet ﷺ, the Sahaba, and so on. We are finished. And now today we will take the 2nd century and also the 3rd century, inshallah. Then the Muwatta of Imam Malik, that's a book. Musannaf Abdul Razak, which is another book. Musannaf Ibn Abi Shaybah, which is another book. So these 3 books are the main 3 books that we will talk about regarding the 2nd century. Then introduction to the 3rd century, and we will talk about the Musnad of Imam Ahmad, and then a small introduction to the 6 books of Hadith. And as you can see, after that we will take Bukhari, Muslim, Abu Dawud, Tirmidhi, Nasa'i is meant to be there as well, and then Ibn Majah. So I've missed out here, Nasa'i, you can add that on. So as for an introduction to the 2nd century, then in the beginning of the 2nd century, it started off with 2 main types of people. The first, it started off with the younger tabi'een, the young tabi'een. So those who are from the tabi'een, but the young ones, because obviously the elder ones, they have now passed away. So some of the younger tabi'een were still there. And in fact, anybody know who was for example, Anas radiallahu anhu. Anyone know which age or which year he passed away?
108.
After 100. The exact year, the ulama differ slightly. But 108? No.
105.
No.
1110.
Sorry, I can't remember at all. Anyways, the point being is that he lived right towards the end of the 1st century. I can't remember the exact date at the moment. But so he was from one of the last companions who had passed away. And there were a couple of other companions who might have passed away after 100. But the point being is that the majority of the people who were there were either the young tabi'een, so even the elder tabi'een, majority of them had now passed away, and also the students of the tabi'een, the atba' at-tabi'een. So that's how the second century started, and majority of the 2nd century were with these people. And also, as we mentioned yesterday, we talked about the fitna of Uthman radiallahu anhu when he was killed. And after that, Ahlul Bid'ah started to appear. Now in the 2nd century, it became a lot more than the first. So Ahlul Bid'ah were there in the 1st century, but now there were a lot more in the 2nd century. But also in the 2nd century, there were great ulama who were present in the 2nd century, like Imam Malik, Imam al-Shafi'i, Sufyan al-Thawri, Imam Awza'i, and so on. There were many of them, and they were all present in the 2nd century. We will mention some of them shortly, inshallah. And then also there was now a difference between tadween and tasnif. If you look here, like some of the books that I brought today, the first book that I showed you, for example, is titled Tadween as-Sunnah. It's called Tadween as-Sunnah. What we're studying now normally comes under the title of Tadween. But there's another word which is called Tasnif. And normally Tadween as-Sunnah is translated to documentation of hadith, and Tasnif is more authoring of hadith. That's why you'll sometimes when you talk about the author, you say Musannif of the book. That's from the word Tasnif. But there's a slight difference between the meaning in the two. Tadween in Arabic, it just basically means to compile. So you get what, so the Sahaba, for example, their scrolls and the scrolls of Tabi'een, any hadith that they heard, they will just write it all together. But when it comes to Tasnif, the difference is Tasnif, not only are you compiling, but you are now ordering those hadith. You are ordering, so you would either order them, for example, in terms of the topics. So you mentioned all the hadith regarding Aqidah, all the hadith regarding fiqh, all the hadith regarding the other topics, and so on. So that's why now we wouldn't really say that that's Tadween anymore, we'll say it's Tasnif. So we'll say, when you talk about books now, we will say the Musannif is this person, because people normally order their books in chapters and so on. But if it was just a random compilation, that's called Tadween. So now if you do see a book called Tadween as-Sunnah, or the word Tadween, you know what that means, and Tasnif, you know what that means. And sometimes people do just use it as synonyms as well. Also, in this century, instead of just writing a hadith, now they would write down also the aqwal of the Sahaba, the speech of the Sahaba, and also the speech of the Tabi'een. So, if you look at the scrolls of the Sahaba, they will just have a hadith. But you look at the scrolls of the Tabi'een, majority of the time it's just a hadith, and sometimes you might find some aqwal of the Sahaba also. But in the 2nd century, and we're going to talk about a couple of these books, you'll find that some of them were just books which were only focused on writing and compiling the aqwal of the Sahaba and the Tabi'een. And the last point regarding this is that the previous scrolls that we mentioned, the scrolls of the Sahaba and the scrolls of the Tabi'een, they were now being added into these bigger books. So, if you go now to the next page, page 26. Just to save time, I've written this out, or it's written out for you. People who compiled books in this century. So here are names of some of the people in the century. Some of them are from the Tabi'een, some of them from the Tabi'een and so on, who have written books in this century. So we've got firstly Ibn Jurayj, and we've got the death dates. I've written the dates that they are passed away as well. We have Ma'mar, we have Abu Ammar, Abdurrahman ibn Amr al-Awza'i, so Imam al-Awza'i, Shu'bah ibn al-Hajjaj, he was the one that I mentioned the story, who traveled yesterday. Sufyan al-Thawri, al-Layth, Hamad ibn Salama, Imam Malik, Abdullah ibn Mubarak, Sufyan ibn Uyayna, Waqi' ibn Jarrah, Abdullah ibn Wahab, Muhammad ibn Idris al-Shafi'i, Imam al-Shafi'i, Abdul Razzaq al-Sana'ani, rahimahumullah jami'ah. So these are some of the main, there are a few more, but some of the great muhaddithun of the time who actually wrote and compiled books during this century. However, the most important ones from this, or the more famous ones from these, are three. The first is the one of Imam Malik, the Muwatta of Imam Malik. The second is Musannaf Abdul Razzaq, and the third is Musannaf Ibn Abi Shaybah. And these three we will go through, inshallah. I don't think Ibn Abi Shaybah is mentioned in that list, but he is also one of them. Khatib al-Baghdadi, in one of his books, Al-Jami', he says, and as for the Muwatta of Imam Malik, this is the one that is given precedence from this type, and it is obligatory to start with its mention, not his mention, with its mention before any other books. Meaning, the greatest books from the 2nd century is the Muwatta of Imam Malik. Hence, we will start by mentioning and talking about the Muwatta of Imam Malik. So, like we mentioned, today's lesson is mostly talking about the books themselves. And the way we will talk about each book is that firstly we will start with a short biography of the author themselves. very short, nothing long, maybe a minute or so, just a few, a few points regarding each Imam. And then when talking about the book, we will talk about a number of different things. We will talk about the name of the book. We will talk about the methodology of the book, how is the book structured, what was the objective of the author, what are the differences between some of the books which are similar. For example, Sahih Muslim, Sahih Bukhari, are the differences or is it, written in the same way? Some of the explanations of these books, we will mention them also, inshallah. So this is a general brief overview of how we will go through each of these books, inshallah. So we start off with the biography of Imam Malik. So we're going through Muwatta al-Imam Malik. So the book is called Al-Muwatta and it's written by Imam Malik. So Imam Malik, his name is Malik ibn Anas ibn Malik. His name is Malik ibn Anas ibn Malik. Don't get confused with, there's two people that people sometimes get this name confused with. The first is the companion, which is the other way around, Anas ibn Malik. But this is Malik ibn Anas. And also, there's a scholar in Arabic language called, there's a book called Alfiyat ibn Malik. Alfiyat ibn Malik, which is 1,000-line poetry by somebody called Ibn Malik. But it's a different person. He came later on. I can't remember when he passed away, but he came, maybe about 5-6 centuries later on. So Imam Malik, his name is Malik ibn Anas ibn Malik. And his kunya is any name which starts off with the word Abu, or for a woman, Ummu, with the father of, or the mother of, and normally it's the name after it is the name after the eldest child. So Imam Malik, his name was Abu Abdullah. His kunya was Abu Abdullah. And a laqab, we have laqab written here. Laqab is like, it's different to a kunya slightly. Kunya is Abu something and something. A laqab is like a title that person gets. So for example, if you take Umar radiallahu anhu, his name was Umar, or Umar ibn Khattab. And his kunya was Abu Hafs. And his laqab was Al-Faruq and Amir al-Mu'mineen. So the leader of the believers. So that's like a laqab, like a title. So the laqab of Imam Malik was Imam Dar al-Hijrah. Imam Dar al-Hijrah, the Imam of the place of Hijrah, i.e. the Imam of Medina. He was known as the Imam of Medina. He was born in Medina. So this is, when I was just an overview, just a general overview of the Imam. He was born in Medina in the year 93. 93, and he passed away in the year 179. 179. How old does that make him? 86. So that means he was 86 years old when he passed away. He was brought up in a household that sought Hadith. So the house that he was from was a household that they would study Hadith. And some have even said that his father was a Sahabi. Some have said that his grandfather was a Sahabi, whilst others have said he was a Tabi'i. His grandfather was a Tabi'i. In his early years, he memorized the Quran, and he also memorized Hadith. He started memorizing Hadith, and only at the age of 21, he started to give fatwa. He started to answer questions of the people, and he started to give fatwa at the age of 21. And he stayed in Medina. He didn't travel outside of Medina. He stayed in Medina, but because he was from Medina, a lot of people, when they normally go for Hajj, they go Mecca, and then they also like to go Medina also. That's how he met many of the other scholars and many of the other muhaddithun. As for some of his famous teachers, then from his teachers was somebody called Abu Suhail. Abu Suhail, and he was his uncle. He was his uncle. And also Rabi'ah, and also Ayyub as-Sikhtiyani. Ayyub as-Sikhtiyani. We mentioned yesterday that he had a scroll as well. Abu az-Zinad. Yahya ibn Abi Kathir. Yahya ibn Abi Kathir. Imam al-Zuhri. Imam al-Zuhri. And also Imam Nafi'. Imam Nafi'. Nafi' Mawla Abdullah ibn Umar. The freed slave of Abdullah ibn Umar. Or Umar. Abdullah ibn Umar. And an interesting fact regarding Nafi' was that, and by the way, this sometimes people also get confused. You know, in the Qira'at, there's also somebody called Imam Nafi'. These are two different people. Okay, so Imam Nafi' was the teacher of Imam Malik. He is different to Imam Nafi' from the Qira'at. So, but an interesting fact regarding Imam Nafi' Mawla ibn Umar is that there's something that Muhaddithun call al-silsila al-zahabiyya, the golden chain. The golden chain. And that golden chain, some have mentioned one regarding Abu Hurairah and so on, but the most famous opinion is that the golden chain is when Imam Malik narrates a hadith from Nafi', who narrates a hadith from Ibn Umar, who narrates a hadith from the Prophet ﷺ. So Malik and Nafi' and Ibn Umar and Rasulullah ﷺ. So, and it's called the golden chain for a few reasons. Firstly, because of how short that chain is. So as you can see, there's only two people between Imam Malik and the Prophet ﷺ, one tabi'i and one sahabi. And secondly, is that chain that if you see that chain, if you see those names, then you don't need to check, you don't need to do any research, you just know it's authentic. You just know it is authentic. So this is what the ulama call al-silsila al-dhahabiyya, the golden chain. Okay, some of the famous contemporaries of Imam Malik. So from them is Abu Hanifa. Imam Abu Hanifa was a contemporary of Imam Malik. Contemporary meaning other scholars at the same time. So other scholars. So contemporaries can also be used for classmates as well and so on, because not once, let's say a student studying, whilst he's studying, they won't really call them a contemporary. But after they will graduate, for example.
They met like they stay at the same time.
When I say contemporary, it's not a condition that they met, but it just means that they were alive at the same time. Some of them might have met, some of them may not.
But Abu Hanifa and Imam Malik didn't.
They met now. Actually, no, Imam Abu Hanifa, no, he didn't. He didn't meet him, no. His student met him, Abu Yusuf. Abu Yusuf met him. And that's the famous story of the mud that you might have heard before. Which I don't want to go into at the moment. No. The death date of Abu Hanifa, 150. 150. He was born in the year 80 and passed away in the year 150. Imam Abu Hanifa. No, and the story I mentioned because we are talking about Imam Malik. The story of mud is basically a handful, and I'll summarize the story. However, the handful, the ulama differ exactly how much it's equivalent to. And when Abu Yusuf, who was a student of Imam Abu Hanifa, he went to Imam Malik, he asked him, how much is a mud according to you? So Imam Malik told him, and to prove this point, he called the people of Medina and he said, all of you from your house, bring your mud. And they all brought the exact same amount. And the people that were living in Medina were either the children or the grandchildren of the Sahaba. So it shows that they have taken this, and this is something known in time of Medina, that's how much a mud was. So Abu Yusuf even said that if Imam Abu Hanifa was to see this, he would change his opinion regarding how much a mud is. No. Okay, so we had Imam Abu Hanifa, we had Layth ibn Sa'ad. Layth ibn Sa'ad. Shu'bah ibn al-Hajjaj. Shu'bah ibn al-Hajjaj, Ma'mar was another, and a few others as well. Some of the famous students of Imam Malik, his famous students, Sufyan ibn Uyayna, Abdullah ibn Mubarak. Abu Hanifa met Abdullah ibn Mubarak. There's one line, it's an incident regarding, it's narrated, I remember reading it in one of Ibn Qayyim's books, is that Abu Hanifa, he went, and when he was with Abdullah, Abu Hanifa, he doesn't do Rafal Yadayn. Okay, so he doesn't put his hands up. So they were praying together, and after the Salah finished, Abu Hanifa, he said to Abdullah Mubarak, that why in Salah are you trying to fly? Why are you trying to? Because he thought, his opinion was that you don't do it. Then Abdullah Mubarak said to him, if I wanted to fly, I would have done so in the beginning of Salah. Because in the beginning, they all do Rafal Yadayn. It's just the time of Ruku' that they don't. And that kind of finished the discussion. So that's one story narrated regarding that. Now, also another student is Abdul Rahman ibn Mahdi. Abdul Rahman ibn Mahdi. Okay, some statements of the scholars regarding the ulama. Now, by the way, the biography I'm giving is very summarized. Even the name, normally if you listen to the name, they mention the whole name. I just mentioned one or two names just to summarize it. So regarding statements of the scholars, I'm only going to mention one statement. It's mentioned by I think Imam Bayhaqi. He said, if the ulama are mentioned, if the scholars are mentioned, then Imam Malik is the star. Meaning, he's the highest from them and the most lofty. He has the most loftiest station from them. So that shows the status of Imam Malik. Sorry, Imam Bayhaqi. Okay, now we move on to the book, regarding his book. The name of the book is Muwatta. So in Arabic you write Mim, Waw, Ta, and then the Hamza will be written on an Alif. So you write an Alif and put Hamza on top. And why is it called Al-Muwatta? What does Muwatta mean? Now Muwatta has two meanings. The word Muwatta has two meanings, and both of these meanings can apply to this book. The first meaning is that it is easy. So Muwatta means to be something which is easy. And the second is something which is agreed upon. Something which is agreed upon or is accepted. And that's something that Imam Malik said himself. Imam Malik, he said, I showed my book in Muwatta, I showed my book to 70 fuqaha, scholars of fiqh. Scholars. I showed my book to 70 fuqaha, scholars from Medina. And all of them agreed upon it. So I called it Al-Muwatta. So I named it or called it Al-Muwatta. So that's what the word actually means, the word. Okay, so we could say maybe in a more linguistic sense, this is the meaning. But when you say a book is a Muwatta, because there's other Muwatta'at as well, not just the Muwatta Imam Malik. When you say a book is a Muwatta, what does that actually mean? What that means is that it's a book that contains Hadith, and it also contains the aqwal of the Sahaba and the Tabi'in. So it's not just a Hadith book, but it also contains many of the aqwal of the Sahaba and the Tabi'in. And we're going to mention how many in a little while, inshallah. And it also contains something called balaghat, Balaghat is something where Imam Malik, he would just say Balaghani and so on. Balaghani means it has reached me. So he would just say it has reached me, and he wouldn't mention the whole chain. He would not mention the whole chain. For some of them, not all of them, some of them. Okay. Now, Imam Malik, he would only mention, in this book, he would only write those ahadith which are authentic, which he considered to be authentic. Okay. Now, if a chain is not mentioned, then we can't say that the hadith is authentic. Okay, and we're going to get to a statement of Imam Shafi'i later on, that he said that the most authentic book after the Quran is Muwatta Imam Malik. That's something that Imam Shafi'i said, which we're going to talk about towards the end, inshallah. But then the question is, how can these balaghat be considered, authentic and so on? And that is because those balaghat, later on when the ulama looked into them, they found those chains of narrations. They found those chains of narrations. So Imam Malik mentioned it without the chain. But then through their research and other books where they found the exact same hadith and so on, they found these chains. And when they found those chains and they looked into them, they realized that they are all, majority of them are authentic. Majority of them are authentic.
The other hadith and the statements were also mentioned without the chains?
No. The majority of them were mentioned with, but there were some that he didn't. So some hadith or some aqwal he would say, just balaghani, it has reached me. Okay? So some of them. So some of them, most of them he wrote the chain, but some of them he didn't.
For the balaghat.
And if he didn't mention the chain, he would start it off with balaghani, so that's called balagha. Make sense? Bulugh al-Maram is different. That's like Ibn Hajar. That's different.
Any reason why?
Balagha. Okay, look. So how would Imam Malik normally write hadith? How would the scholars normally write hadith? If you had a hadith, they would normally write the whole chain. So they would say, for example, حدثنا نافع مولى عبد الله بن عمر قال حدثنا عبد الله بن عمر قال سمعت رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم يقول and in the hadith. So he write the whole chain. So he would write I heard from Nafi', who heard from Ibn Umar, who heard the Prophet say, he mentioned the hadith. But with the balaghat, he would just write balaghani, which in English means it has reached me that the Prophet said. It's only with the balaghat, yeah. So if he did that, it's called balaghat. That's the name. Okay, that's what it's called. He would say balaghani. So most of, when he wrote the hadith, he would write the chain. He would write it. But there was some that he just wrote in this manner. It has reached me that the Prophet said. Okay, so
Any reason for that? He didn't mention.
maybe according to him it was authentic. So he thought it was authentic, so he just wrote it. Okay, maybe he didn't expect too many people to read it on later. And sometimes you would find some of the ulama is that in that time there was a lot more people who would study hadith compared to now. So maybe some of these hadith he just knew that if he wrote it, they're more famous hadith. People will just know it's authentic. And that's why you'll find many books that even though some of the ulama, they write books or they mention a lot of narrations, and sometimes they will mention narrations which are weak. Okay, I'm not talking about Muwatta Imam Malik, just generally. And somebody may mention that why do ulama mentioning weak hadith in their books? One of the reasons is because the ulama at that time knew that there were a lot of people studying hadith, and their objective was just to compile everything which is narrated. And then so everything's there in front of the student, and the student he himself can decipher if it's authentic or not. So that may be one reason. Okay, similar that he just thought that people will just know if it's authentic or not. I'm not sure exactly why, but the point being is that in this book of Muwatta, he had a hadith, he had aqwal of the Sahaba and the Tabi'een, and all of them were written with the whole chain. But there was some that he wrote in this manner, which in Arabic starts off with balaghani, which means it has reached me. So some of them he did not write the chain. Some of them he did not write the chain. But like I mentioned, that the ulama, it was Ibn Abdul Barr. Ibn Abdul Barr, we're going to talk about an explanation. He came later on and he found the chains for all of them, apart from 4. He found the chains of all of them apart from 4. And then Al-Hafidh Ibn Salah, who came later on, he found the other 4 as well.
Recording in progress.
Now, the next question is regard how many ahadith are there in this book? So in the Muwatta, how many hadith are there? There's a statement of Abu Bakr al-Abhari. Abu Bakr al-Abhari. Abu Bakr al-Abhari. He says that in the Muwatta, the narrations from the Prophet ﷺ and the Sahaba and the Tabi'een in total are 1,720. 1,720. 1,720. 1720. 1720. 1720. He said, Al-Musnadu minha, the ones which are Musnad from them are 600. Those which are Mursal, are 228, 228. Those which are Mawquf are 613, 613. And those which are from the speech of the Tabi'een, 613, the previous one. And from the speech of the Tabi'een, 285, 285. So, Mawquf, anyone remember what Mawquf means? I think I mentioned it. Saying of a Sahabi. So Mawquf means saying of a Sahabi. So speech of the Sahabi are how many? 613. And of the Tabi'een? 285. Mursal means that the Tabi'i, he said that the Prophet ﷺ said. Meaning, majority of the time he missed out the Sahabi. So the Tabi'i said that the Prophet ﷺ said. So the most of the time the Sahabi is not mentioned. The Sahabi is not mentioned. Sorry?
The chain is without Sahabi.
This chain is without the Sahabi. The definition the ulama gave of Mursal is that hadith which the Tabi'i attributes to the Prophet ﷺ. Sorry?
That is authentic, but anyway.
No, by itself, Mursal is actually considered weak because somebody is missing in the chain. And but when they look into the ones of the Mursal, the Marasil of Imam Malik, they're good. Most of them authentic because when the ulama looked into them, they found other chains which showed that there's a Sahabi who's there, but Imam Malik didn't mention it. Okay. Any time you find that anyone is missing in the chain, it's weak. But if the ulama can find other chains in other books and so on, with the same hadith, then they can strengthen that hadith. Okay. And the reason we don't say, when I give definition of Mursal, the reason I said what a Tabi'i attribute to the Prophet ﷺ instead of saying the Sahabi is missing. Anyone know why? Why do we say that? There's the small difference. The first is, and what I'm saying, a Tabi'i attributed to the Prophet ﷺ, or a Tabi'i said that the Prophet ﷺ said. And the second, which I'm saying is incorrect to say, is that the Sahabi, a Mursal hadith is where the Sahabi is missing. No, only one person.
Because he was sure that it was said by someone.
No, not necessarily. Because that applies to both. That can apply to both.
Could mean
I know you know. So other people too.
I don't remember exactly who said it, but he remembers. He heard.
You're on the right lines. I mean, the reason they don't mention it might not be because they don't remember. Maybe they just, if I give the example yesterday, if Sheikh Fawzan said something, for example, and I heard from my friend, And if I mention it in my lesson, I'll just say that Sheikh Fawzan said this. I won't always mention the whole chain. So it's not necessarily, they forgot or they don't want to mention it. It could be for different reasons. The reason for this,
He would have mentioned from the other tabi'in.
because he could have heard it from other tabi'een also. So if one tabi'i says, the Prophet ﷺ said, it's not a condition that the person that's missing is a sahabi. It could be other tabi'een and then a sahabi. So if you were to say that the sahabi is missing, the majority of the time, yes, but there may be other hadith where he's heard it from other tabi'in. Anyways, that's studied more in the science of Mustalah al-Hadith. Anyway, so we mentioned this statement here, which shows us how many hadith are in there. However, there's other narrations as well. There's one narration of Ibn al-Habbab. Ibn al-Habbab. He says, Imam Malik narrated 100,000 hadith. Imam Malik narrated 100,000 hadith. Meaning when he is taught in his lessons, he has narrated 100,000 hadith. He chose 10,000 hadith for his Muwatta. He chose 10,000 hadith for his Muwatta. Then he checked and summarized it. Until it became 500 hadith. So in here, he's saying in total there are 500. Okay? 500 hadith. Right? So, okay. Yahya ibn Laythi, he says, there is 2,816 hadith and narrations. There are 2,816 hadith and narrations, i.e. in the Muwatta of Imam Malik. Two eight one six. And there's others, aqwal of some of the ulama as well. The point being now, can you notice that some of the numbers are different? There's a few reasons for this. The first is that, some of them, it depends on how they count it. So for example, the last one where he says 500 hadith, then he's just counting the hadith, he's not counted the aqwal of the sahaba and the tabi'een and so on. So that could be one way. The other is that Imam Malik, he actually spent 40 years writing this book, 40 years compiling this book. And every time he would relook at the book, summarize, take things out, add things in, and so on. So the narrator that narrates this and narrates how many hadith in there, he is basing it upon what? He's basing it upon how many hadith he heard from Imam Malik. So let's say in the first year there was so many hadith. 10 years later, Imam Malik is taken a lot of hadith out and so on. So now the next person who's added, who's counted, he's got a different number of hadith, a different amount of hadith. And that's why sometimes when you buy these books, the Imam Malik, you'll find that you have to be careful because you get the Muwatta of Imam Malik, but you get more than one riwayah of it. So you get you can buy Muwatta with the riwayah of, it might be Al-Layth, Imam Layth, or Yahya, either Layth or Yahya, one of the two. Anyways, so that's one narration that you would buy, and he has a certain number of hadith. And then you can get another version, which is by I think Muhammad ibn Hassan al-Shaybani, one of the students of Abu Hanifa. And his version, because he's narrating the Muwatta, how he heard it. So his number might be slightly different. So that's why when you buy Muwatta, especially in Arabic, you'll find that there are different riwayat of them. Majority of it is the same, but there might be slight differences. So you'll find that the Muwatta of Muhammad ibn Hassan al-Shaybani, his riwayah, that is focusing a bit more on the fiqh issues. Especially those relating to the Hanafi madhab. So afterwards he will comment sometimes and he will talk about the Hanafi madhab because he's a student of Imam Abu Hanifa. So that's why when you buy these books, it's very important to also look at different riwayat. And the reason for this is because in those days, they never used to have printing, like we have now, that we have a nice PDF and we can save it and WhatsApp it anyone and WhatsApp it to the shop and he prints it out and everybody has the exact same print. Okay? Many of the time, when the ulama write a book, they would actually sit in a lesson like this and they would do imla of the book. Imla meaning they will speak and everybody just writes. That's the way that's the way that they will get books. Or they would have people called nusakh. Nusakh are basically people who would come and basically copy out the book for you. Now that's a job. They would copy out the book. Okay, so their job is that you give them a book and they will copy it out for you. I remember one story. We have a book called Al-Mughni by Ibn Qudama, which is comparative fiqh. It has all of the fiqh issues and opinions, all of the mazahib in there. It's not only the four mazahib, but others of the Salaf as well. And there's one scholar who was traveling and he came across a scholar who had this book, Al-Mughni, and he wanted the book. So normally if somebody wants a book, they would say, okay, here's the book, you copy the book out and you have your own copy and you can go. But he said, oh, I'm only here for a few days. I need to go away for Hajj or something. I can't remember exactly what it was. So and there's no way, Mughni is now about 15 volumes. So there's no way he's going to be able to write all 15 volumes in 1 or 2 days. So what the Sheikh did, the Sheikh gathered all of his students. He gathered all of his students and he split Al-Mughni. So each student maybe had 1 volume of Mughni. So each student wrote out 1 volume and the following day or the day after, he had the whole of Mughni with him. So that's why it's very important to understand the situation of how books were written in those days. It's different to how it is now. Okay, so that's why we may have slightly different numberings when it comes to different books. And even, we're going to talk about Imam Muslim in a little while, but even Imam Muslim, the numbering of hadith can be slightly different. And there's 3 main ways how to count the hadith of Imam Muslim. We'll talk about it when we get there due to time. Okay, let's quickly finish this inshallah. Regarding some of the methodology, so when it says here, what is his methodology? These are just some points. How did Imam Malik actually write the book? So we mentioned what Muwatta is, and he has aqwal of the Prophet ﷺ, Sahaba and Tabi'een also. He also wrote the book in chapters. So he's written in different chapters. So he would have a chapter. He would have a chapter on Tahara, for example, purification, and chapter on Salah and so on. And the reason I mention this, you might think, okay, that's quite straightforward. No. Remember the schools of Sahaba and schools of Tabi'een, they just gathered all the hadith without any ordering. But now you can see there's chapters involved. So it's slightly different to the first century. Secondly, like I mentioned, aqwal of the hadith, aqwal of the Sahaba, and also Tabi'een. So when you say aqwal of Sahaba and Tabi'een, many of the time, their fiqhi opinions will be mentioned with that as well. So this Tabi'i, his fiqhi opinion regarding this issue was this. And likewise with the companions. Also, he used something which is called Amalu Ahli al-Madina, the actions of the people of Medina. And this is something that he would use more than some of the other Imams. Amalu Ahli al-Madina is that in those issues where there's maybe not a clear-cut hadith, okay, and something which required maybe more of an explanation, he would look at the people of Medina and what they would do. Because the majority of people in Medina at that time were the sons and the grandsons of the Sahaba and the Tabi'een. So that means the majority of the knowledge that they, and the traditions and the things that they have learned were from the Sahaba. So if you, for example, exactly how much was a mud, we gave the story of that before. So how did he come to that conclusion of the mud of that amount, however much he said? Because of the action of the people of Medina. So there may not be an exact hadith that says a mud is this much point, this much liters, or whatever the case may be. It's nothing precise like that. So where has he come to this opinion? How has he concluded with this? The actions of the people of Medina. So this is something that he would use more than some of the other Imams because he was from Medina. The next question: where does his book rank amongst the other hadith books? Where does his book rank amongst the other hadith books? In terms of authenticity, or even in terms of status, many of the ulama initially placed it as number 3, meaning after Bukhari and Muslim. So it's Bukhari, Muslim, then the Muwatta Imam Malik. Many of the ulama would do that. However, as time went on, then it dropped down to number 7. Okay, so I'll give you the 9 books of hadith. You know, sometimes they say 6, and sometimes they take it to 9. We'll mention 9. I'll give you the ordering so that we know it for this, and also we can answer it for the future questions for each other book, so you know what the status of the other books are. So number 1 would be Sahih al-Bukhari. Number 1 would be Sahih al-Bukhari. Number 2 would be Sahih Muslim. Number 3 would be Sunan Abi Dawud. Then Sunan at-Tirmidhi, or it's also known as Jami' at-Tirmidhi. Sunan at-Tirmidhi or Jami' at-Tirmidhi. And then Sunan al-Nisa'i. This is number 5, Sunan al-Nisa'i. And number 6, Sunan Ibn Majah. And then number 7, Muwatta Imam Malik. Muwatta Malik. Number 8, Musnad Ahmad. Musnad of Imam Ahmad. And number 9, Sunan ad-Darimi. Sunan ad-Darimi. Now, this ordering that I've told you is the main ordering that's kind of mentioned now. But if you do study, especially if you study each book individually, and you look at what the ulama have said, ulama are different. So you'll find some of them placed others above others. So some might place Tirmidhi above Abu Dawud and so on. And this was all for different reasons, okay? But this is the main order that we have now. And some people may ask that why was Muwatta Imam Malik dropped down later on. And some of the reasons for that is because the majority of his ahadith are mentioned in the first 6 books. So the majority of his hadith you can find in Bukhari, Muslim, and Sunan Tirmidhi and Nisa'i and others, especially Bukhari and Muslim. And just because, when you hear a reference of a hadith that this is narrated in Bukhari and Muslim, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's only in Bukhari and Muslim. Sometimes it can be Bukhari, Muslim, and Tirmidhi, Nisa'i, and all of the others. But the reason people say Bukhari and Muslim is because if you hear Bukhari and Muslim, you know it's authentic, so you don't really need the other references. But it is good to know the references if you need to go to them. But another reason why the Muwatta Imam Malik might have been dropped down is because the previous 6 are focusing more just on hadith. But Muwatta Imam Malik had hadith and aqwal of Sahaba and Tabi'in. And you saw quite a few, 200 and so on. Bukhari and Muslim, they had them very little. Maybe you can count on your fingers. That's how little they had. Okay, we have a doubt here. The doubt is statement of Imam al-Shafi'i. What did Imam al-Shafi'i he say? Imam al-Shafi'i he said that the most authentic book after the book of Allah is the Muwatta Imam Malik. He said, أصح كتاب بعد كتاب الله موطأ الإمام مالك. But Imam Shafi'i was a student of Imam Malik. If I didn't mention it, then you can mention it, that he was a student of Imam Malik. Right. Which book is the most authentic book normally? What do we say? Bukhari or Muslim. So now, it can be an issue. How is Imam Shafi'i saying that the most authentic book is Muwatta and not Bukhari and Muslim? That's the first. The main reason is Bukhari wasn't alive at that time. When Bukhari came, he died about 50 years or something more after Imam Shafi'i. So he wasn't alive, or he wasn't there during the time of Imam Shafi'i. That is the main reason. There's one statement I was going to mention before, which I forgot. You can just add it at the end of the methodology. Imam Malik, he said, and this is regarding the 40 years, okay? So he said, or actually there's a person called Safwan ibn Umar, he said, Safwan ibn Umar, he said, صفوان ibn Umar, he said, عرضنا على مالك الموطأ في 40 يوما. We basically studied the Muwatta from Imam Malik. We studied al-Muwatta from Imam Malik in 40 days. In 40 days. 40. فقال, Imam Malik said, كتاب ألفته في 40 سنة. That this is a book I have written, or it took me to write 40 years. It took me 40 years to write this book. أخذتموه في 40 يوما. And you have taken it in 40 days. And you have taken it and studied it in 40 days. قل ما تتفقهون فيه. Very little do you truly understand what is in it. Very little do you truly understand what is in it. And that's how it is. Even, I'll give it like even personally, I started a few months ago to write like some small books and small articles, which they're not published at the moment. I just wrote it for myself. And a couple of them I've done as lectures. And I sit there and I've done the lecture, 40 minutes, 1 hour, that's a lecture. When it came to actually typing the exact same thing, just typing, it took me days, maybe at least a week to type it. Because writing something is a lot different. So I had to, think of the exact words, then I had to think of a correct translation. When you're speaking, you can get away with a general meaning, but here you have to choose a precise. And then you have to research the reference as well. So if I mention, when I'm speaking, I can mention the hadith person said this and I can move on. If I don't remember it, I can just move on, you get away with it. But when there's something written, you have to make sure that everything's precise. Find the reference, find the exact number, and not just copy. You have to actually go to a book. There's been times where somebody said, the reference is this, and when I go to check the book, I can't find it in the book. So there've been some times where I couldn't find it at all, and I just left it. I didn't add. The point being is that that's somebody like me, which took a week. That obviously the time Imam Malik, 40 years, he's just doing Muwatta Imam Malik. So what goes into actually writing a book? Nowadays it's a lot easier for us to attain that knowledge. We type in a hadith, just type in the first 2 words, or type in a few keywords, and the hadith might come from a quick Google search. But the understanding that we have now, compared to the understanding that they had before, there's no comparison. That's why even Imam Malik is saying to his students, قَلَّ مَا تَتَفَقَّهُونَ فِيهِ. Very little do you actually truly understand the whole knowledge of this book. Okay? So that shows that, seeking knowledge, the Prophet said, إِنَّمَا الْعِلْمُ بِالتَّعَلُّمِ. The knowledge is by ta'allum. Ta'allum here is basically referring to actually going, sitting with a teacher, writing, revising, memorizing, being tested, and so on. It's not just a quick Google search. And how many times have you seen that when maybe a WhatsApp message comes to you with a hadith, you think, mashallah, nice hadith, but again, the next day you've forgotten it. Why? Because it came to you really quick, you don't really truly understand that hadith. Now we'll finish off with some of the famous explanations of Al-Muwatta. I was actually going to maybe go into depth regarding some of these books as well, but we don't have time. We've taken too long on the Muwatta of Imam Malik. I'll just mention. The first book is At-Tamheed. At-Tamheed. We'll take a break in 2 minutes, inshallah. Yeah? We'll take a break in 2 minutes after I've mentioned this. The first is At-Tamheed. And the second is called Al-Istidhkar. The first is At-Tamheed and the second is Al-Istidhkar. Al-Istidhkar. So you can spell it maybe Istidhkar. Istidhkar. Okay. Both of these are written by the same person. Both of these are written by Ibn Abdul Barr. And both of them are voluminous. Like you have to buy minimum 10 volumes each. Or approximately. However, what's the difference between the two? The first one, At-Tamheed, focuses more on the hadith perspective. So it's an explanation more on the hadith perspective. Talk about the chain narrations, people in the chain, and everything to do with science of hadith. As for the second, it focused more on the fiqh perspective, the rulings. Focus more on the rulings. Okay. So these are the main two explanations. If anybody did want to buy any explanations of the Muwatta of Imam Malik, then these two are good explanations to buy. We'll stop here inshallah, and after 5 minutes break, we'll start again at 50. At 50 past or 10 to, we will start again inshallah. Sallallahu ala nabiyyina Muhammad.
Recording stopped.
The books are here if anybody does want to look at the books or take pictures of the books.
So if it is written, how come there are
It, no, no. It is written. The book is written, but there weren't many copies. So maybe Imam Malik had a copy. But when the students came, they had to write themselves. That makes sense. So when Abdullah had the book, he had the book with him.
So how come there are different number of hadiths, like 500, 1,400?
Because when you say the book wasn't written, then the students wrote themselves. So they wrote down what they heard. So Ibn Abdul Barr, he got one of those that were written, and he used that and he explained that. So the students of Imam Malik, they would write down the hadith, and they would have their book. Obviously, after they pass away, the book is either passed on or is copied even more. So one of those narrations, he used that version. Does that make sense?
There are three different numbers, like 500, 700. These are narrated by 3 people. But these were narrated before the death of Imam Malik. So before the death of Imam Malik.
Yeah, so
big difference.
No, big differences, small differences. As some ulama, I'm not sure which one, but they might mention that. The one which was the last copy was this narration. I personally at the moment I don't know which one, but they mention that as well. Okay. لا اصلا اليوم نحن ننتهي الساعه 10
10:30.
اي لكن عندك
الجمعة هيخلص كمان خلاص هيبتدي من 4 ل 8
يعني ساعة بعد العشاء.
ساعه
9:30.
بس دلوقتي بتسيبك من الموعد اللي فاتت مع الحشو بقى كنت بتكلم على
مقاطع موسيقى احنا كنا نسيبها.
اليوم قد نزيد انا قلت لهم اليوم اي صح لكن انا قلت لهم قبل اليوم المفروض ناخذ 8 كتب اخذنا واحد بس انا انسى اسبوع ان شاء الله بحاول
إذا أردت مثلا ممكن هذا يكون تعاون مثلا أو لا
هو عنده مشروع على بكره
ايه مالي مغرب انا طالب مغرب
العصر
مشكلة صباحا سننزل ثم بعد الظهر عندنا هذا الموعد فننتهي عند العصر تقريبا
كنسل موعد الظهر خلاص العصر
متأكد؟
أنا ما أشوف فيها أنت هل عندك شيء جاهز تتكلم عنه
في واحد انا كلمته من الحين لو ارسلوني الليله لكن كلمته بعد المغرب هذا بالمسجد في نزل قلت له لو كان عندك شيء مكتوب باللغه العربيه
استقروا انا معك
أنا قصدي لما يكون الوقت العصر
ايه
يعني مثلا لو تجي الساعة 4 من 4 ل 6
لا انا فهمت بس
الساعة 6 أنا لا أذهب إلى أحمد فارس. أنا قصدي أفضل من الليل.
اي صح افضل من الليل بس في فرصه يعني لو حصل يعني
هو مش برضه الجمعة بس نفس الوقت
الجمعة عندي يعني صلاة الجمعة. أنت الصبح راح تنزل بالساعة كم؟
متى يفتح؟ او هذه الثمان
تبي الصبح الساعة كم؟
لا
طب انا متابع موجود انت معاك رقم صح؟
ايه
خلاص انت حاجه اليوم بلغني انا معاك
بعد الفجر نتواصل خلاص نشوف الوضع لو كان متعب بارك الله
حبيبي
اوكي let's start
This was live.
طيب بعد ما اعدد كله اوكي ready Oh yes, there is exam. That's
There is
what I said.
exam for this.
Is the exam for this?
Very nice.
Next time I'll see you.
Next time. We'll see.
Yes,
Okay.
Start now.
Start.
Recording in progress.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين أما بعد. Two quick points. Firstly, like I said in the beginning, questions at the end. We have more time for questions. We have about 8 books to take today. We've only taken 1. So inshallah, I'm going to speak quicker. So if your hands are not hurting by the end, then you've not been writing. Okay, your hands should be hurting at the end. Secondly, there's also an exam for this dawrah as well. At the end of this dawrah, there will be an exam, inshallah. And when the exam actually is, we'll confirm. Maybe Thursday after the lesson. If you decide, that might be too difficult, then in the following days, inshallah. In the following days, there will be some sort of exam which will be given. And there may also be an exam for usul al-fiqh lessons as well. Okay? And maybe even Nawaqid al-Islam as well. We'll see. And then there might be one big exam for everything. No, we'll inshallah, we'll announce, but just keep that in mind. Okay? So from today, previous 4 days, you have the notes, you have the worksheets, you can start revising, inshallah. Okay, Musannaf Abdul Razak. This is the next book, Musannaf Abdul Razak. Now, just because of time, I'm not really going to talk about Abdul Razak too much, rahimahullah. But we'll mention that Abdul Razak, his full name was he's known as Abdul Razak As-San'ani. As-San'ani. Because Sana'a is a place in which country? In Yemen. So he's from Yemen. So As-San'ani. And he passed away in the year 211. 211. Okay, now Musannaf, this is very important. Do you remember, sometimes I ask you the question, if somebody wanted to find the aqwal of the Sahaba, where would they go? You would go to Musannaf. So Musannaf, if you see a book called Musannaf, then that is not a hadith book. We might have a couple, a few hadith, but the majority of it are the aqwal of the Sahaba and the Tabi'in. The aqwal of the Salaf. And their fiqhi opinions. Okay, so that Sahaba and the Tabi'in, generally the Salaf. Okay, and it's very important. When you want to give a fiqhi ruling, and an alim wants to ijtihad and get to his own ruling, if he just looks at hadith and he doesn't look at any of the aqwal of the Sahaba, then he's deficient. He's deficient in his ijtihad. And that's one thing, Shaykh al-Islam ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah, one thing he was really knowledgeable in was the aqwal and the madhahib of the Sahaba. He knew their opinions. That's what gave him so much authority when it came to fiqh and so on. So that's Musannaf Abdul Razak. We'll move on to the next one, and I'm not going to go into too much detail because maybe many of you have not even heard of these books before. So I think minimum the main objective is that you are familiar with the names. Okay, and if that's what you benefit from this dawrah, you are familiar and you have an idea of these names. Alhamdulillah, I think that's something very good. As for the extra information, then I've mentioned to you the books, and to be honest, most of the time, maybe some of the extra information, the exact numbers and so on, people don't really remember anyway. So as long as you have the main information of each book, then alhamdulillah. The next is Musannaf ibn Abi Shaybah. Musannaf ibn Abi Shaybah. Okay, and he passed away in the year 235. 235. Okay, now some of the differences between the two musannaf, because both of these are musannafat. Some of the differences is that firstly, the second, Musannaf ibn Abi Shaybah, is a lot bigger. It is, double the size of Musannaf Abdul Razak. And another difference is that Ibn Abi Shaybah, he mainly gathered the opinions of those from Iraq. Because that's where he was from. Whereas Abdul Razak, he had more opinions from Yemen, because he was from there, but also Mecca and Medina and those surrounding places. So this difference is basically, you can see that the opinions that they had were different. And this takes us back to the other point that we were mentioning. Writing books in those times wasn't easy. It's not just Google search and every single thing comes up, an encyclopedia comes up. No, it's they have to travel. So they may miss a hadith here and there because maybe and this is one reason why the ulama differed in the past was because a hadith might not have reached them, and that's because studying was not the same way that we study now. And another difference is that generally the Musannaf of Ibn Abi Shaybah, his narrations are a bit more authentic than Abdul Razak. A bit more authentic than Abdul Razak. So these are regarding these two Musannafat. Now we can move on to the 3rd century. And a small introduction to the 3rd century is that this century is known as the Golden Century. It is known as the Golden Century. Because now, the actual, especially documentation, writing, and compilation of hadith books, this is where it was at its peak. And there now was a difference that not only hadith books were written, but now hadith books on certain topics were written as well. So there were certain books that were written just on the Aqidah. So all those hadith narrations were just referring to Aqidah. Okay, so for example, maybe Imam Ahmad, Al-Radd ala al-Zanadiqah. So that's a big book, and because Al-Jahmiyyah was Zanadiqah, because now we had one of the Ahlul Bid'ah were the Jahmiyyah, and Imam Ahmad had this famous mihna, his trial with them. So he wrote a book refuting them, and in there were those narrations from Ahadith and Sahaba and Tabi'in, which were referring to the topic the Aqidah topic that he was talking about. So in terms of fiqh rulings, they weren't really mentioned in there. Obviously, he had his other book, Musnad, which we're going to talk about shortly. But the point being is that there were more books now specializing in different topics also. As well as books also focusing just on hadith, but other topics and other types of books were also being produced. So for example, we have now books of Sihah, meaning Sahih. So before, there wasn't books which were focused, and the condition was only authentic hadith. So Bukhari and Muslim, Bukhari was the first to do it. So before that, there wasn't a book which was the condition only authentic hadith. Okay, so this is something new in this century. Also, we have some other types of book, Mukhtalaf al-Hadith. Mukhtalaf al-Hadith, or this is just a little bit after the 3rd century, but when I say 3rd century, it includes maybe a bit more after that. But Mushkil al-Hadith are referring and gathering those hadith which look like that they are contradicting. So they would gather those hadith and they would answer Mukhtalaf al-Hadith. And so on. The point being is that different types of books were now being produced. And the main ones we are going to focus on are the 6 books of hadith plus the Musnad of Imam Ahmad. And we will start with the Musnad of Imam Ahmad because he was the most senior of them. What's the meaning of Musnad? Musnad has, in the science of hadith, has 2 meanings. Musnad in the science of hadith has 2 meanings. There's one, the first meaning is in the science of Mustalah al-Hadith. When you say that this hadith is a Musnad hadith, And I mentioned this because it's going to come later with the book of Al-Bukhari. This basically means that it's a whole full connected chain. This hadith is a full connected chain. Nobody is missing in that chain. It's from the word sanad, meaning the full sanad is there. Musnad, the full sanad is there. But there's another meaning, and this is the meaning that we are referring to here. When referring to a book known as a musnad, or the plural being masanid, then that is a book where the ahadith are ordered upon the names of the Sahaba, upon the names of the companions. So, for example, they will mention Abu Hurairah, all of his ahadith, and then Ibn Abbas, all of his hadith, Ibn Umar, all of his ahadith, and so on. So you can see it's different to other books. Other books might have done it in the topic of salah, all of those hadith, topic of wudu, all of those hadith. But here, they're not looking at the topic of the hadith, they're looking at the narrator of the hadith. Okay? And there were three main ways that they would order, the Sahaba. The first way is in alphabetical order. So they will start with Alif or Hamza, and then Ba, and Ta, and so on. So alphabetical order. The second is according to the different tribes. So they will mention, all the Sahaba who are from a certain tribe, they will mention all of them together. But once they finish that tribe, then they'll move on to a different tribe, and so on. And then the third is they will order them according to their virtue, virtue. So they will start off with the most noble, Abu Bakr or Umar, and then go down like that. Okay. Khatib al-Baghdadi, he said, the last way, the third way that we mentioned, the last way is the most beloved to us when narrating from the Musnad. Is the most beloved to us when narrating from the Musnad. Meaning he thought that the best way to do it, if you were to write a Musnad, is the third way. He said the last way is the most beloved to us when narrating from the Musnad. So he preferred the third way. The last way is the most beloved to us when narrating from the Musnad. Okay, the next question, how many Musnads, in Arabic you say Masanid, are there? Now the ulama mentioned there were more than 100 Masanid, books of Musnad books, there were more than 100. Okay? And I was going to mention some of them, but this time I'm not going to mention them. And to be honest, they're not really mentioned, that much, and they're not really known to the people. Even some students may not know them, unless they're specializing in hadith or they are used to referencing. So the main one, when you just hear it's narrated in Musnad, then it's the Musnad of Imam Ahmad. Then it is the Musnad of Imam Ahmad, and his is considered to be the most authentic from all of the Masanid anyway. His is considered to be the most authentic from the Masanid anyway. Okay, the next, the ordering of the Musnad of Imam Ahmad. So how did Imam Ahmad order his Musnad? So he followed the third way. So he followed more towards the third way, which is by the virtues. So I put 8 points here. So what he did was, he started with the hadith of the 10 who were promised paradise. He started with the 10 who were promised paradise. And then he narrated some of the hadith of some other Sahaba. From them, Abdul Rahman ibn Abi Bakr, the son of Abu Bakr. Zayd ibn Kharijah, and a few other companions. A few other companions.
What was the second one?
So the second point is a few different companions. So he did the first, after he finished the first 10, then there's a few other companions I mentioned, Abdul Rahman ibn Bakr, Zayd ibn Kharijah. Don't worry, once you get to the third point, you'll understand why I said that. So the reason I'm saying a few of the companions is because, to be honest, they were a bit random. They weren't, we can't really give one name. Maybe he thought them to be more virtuous than some of the others. Allah, I don't know. The third, after these companions, then he narrated from those companions who are from the family of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. The family of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And then he mentioned those Sahaba who narrated the most hadith. Those Sahaba who narrated the most hadith. And then after that, that's when he started to now narrate from those Sahaba who are in different places. So he narrated all those Sahaba who are in Makkah. And then, so Makkah was first. And then it was Medina. And then it was Sham, Syria and surrounding more countries. And then Kufa. And then Basra. And then the next point, those are hadith that were narrated by the Ansar. Narrated by the Ansar. And then the hadith narrated by Aisha radiallahu anha, and then the other women, the other sahabiyat. And then finally, then the rest of the rest of the tribes, and the rest of the tribes. So this is like basically a big summary of the book. Obviously, the book itself, if you buy the Muassasa Risala print, anyone know how many volumes that is? Anyone want to guess how many volumes? 30, more than 30, more than 40. 52 volumes. The Muslim 52 volumes. There are some prints. There's one print by Darul Salam, the Sheikh. So it's in one volume. It's like a really big, and the writing is really small. But if you get Muassasa Risala, I think Tahqiq by Shu'aib Arnaout, which is, they say, the best print. That's 52 volumes. So you see, it's like a red color. With the references and everything, it equals to be 52 volumes. And from all of the books that we are taking, this is the biggest book that we are taking. Now, the next point, the number of ahadith. How many ahadith did those are there in the Musnad of Imam Ahmad? Al-Hafiz Abu Musa al-Madini, Al-Hafiz Abu Musa al-Madini said he found 30,000 hadith. He found 30,000 hadith. And just to put it in perspective, the Kutub al-Sitta, all of them were approximately, let's say between 3, some were 3,000, some were 4, some were 5, maybe the maximum 6,000. Around about the 5,000 mark. Okay? So they were around about 5,000. But Imam Ahmad was close to 30,000 hadith.
Now the hadiths are going longer because of change.
No, not because of change longer. This is the number of hadith that I mentioned. The number of hadith that he had written in his book. Al-Jazari, he said, Al-Jazari, he said, he counted just under 700 Sahaba from the men. Meaning, how many Sahaba did he mention? Just under 700. Under 700. So about 695, 96, approximately like that. And 96 women. And 96 women who narrated the hadith in the Musnad. 96 women. Just under Sahaba men, from the men, and 96 women. So basically in total, how much is that approximately? Approximately 800 Sahaba. Okay, and the next, are there any fabricated hadith in Musnad Imam Ahmad? Are there any fabricated hadith in the Musnad Imam Ahmad? We did mention that the Musnad Imam Ahmad was from the most authentic Masanid. And he himself, he said, and it's a nice statement, he says, this book I have picked and gathered from this book I have picked and gathered from 750,000 hadith. 750,000 hadith. Meaning, he's saying that he knew about 750,000 hadith. He had all of them, and from them he only chose 30,000 to put in his book. And you'll find likewise similar with Imam Bukhari and Muslim and all of them. You find similar statements that the amount of hadith they actually put in the book was only a fragment of how much they actually knew.
750,000 is.
Well, the chains, different chains. Each chain they used to count as a hadith. And he says, then he carries on to say, and what the Muslimun have differed on from the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, then turn back to this book. Because either you will find it, or it is not considered a proof. Meaning you can see from here, Imam Ahmad, his objective was to gather all of the hadith that a Muslim needs, and which are majority of the time which are authentic as well. Meaning if you don't find it in this book, then most of the time the hadith, it's not either not needed or it's not authentic and so on. Imam Dhabi, he comments and he says, majority of the case is true, even though there are other hadith which are important, which are in the Kutub al-Sitta, which aren't in the Musnad of Ahmad and so on. But the point being is that you can see the objective of Imam Ahmad. I'll repeat what he said. This book I have picked and gathered from 750,000 hadith, and what the Muslimun have differed on from the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, then turn back to this book. Either you will find it in it, or it is not considered a hujjah, it is not considered a proof. But in terms of answering the question, are there any fabricated hadith? Then Ibn Taymiyyah, he comments and he says, in his book Majmu' al-Fatawa, he says, I'll summarize what he says. He said, the people have differed, are there fabricated hadith in here, or in the Musnad? And then he says, there is no difference between the two opinions, meaning those that say yes and those that say no. There's no difference, because the word fabricated has many meanings. And then he says, if the intended meaning is that a person intentionally lied, then there are no fabricated hadith. If the meaning is a person intentionally lied, then there are no fabricated hadith. Okay. No, I'm paraphrasing. He said that the ulama have differed, are there fabricated hadith in the Musnad of Imam Ahmad? And then he says there are no differences between the two opinions. Two opinions meaning those that say yes, there are fabricated hadith. The second, those that say no, there aren't fabricated hadith. And he says the reason for this is because the word fabricated has different meanings. If the intended meaning is that the narrator intentionally lied and fabricated the hadith, then no. But if the meaning is that they did not intend to lie, but they made mistakes, then yes. If the intended meaning is that they made mistakes and they intentionally, on purpose, did not lie, then yes, there are those that hadith a few of those can be found. Okay, I wrote here some books written regarding the Musnad. We don't need to mention that. Okay, next page. As you can see here, students are now encouraged to write more themselves. The general points mentioned are now the same as the previous book. So as you can see, previously I would put name, kunya, this, that about each book, and you fill it in. The points are the exact same. Okay, so you guys can just write it out yourself. You need to get used to writing a bit more now, inshallah. Imam al-Bukhari. Now, I was going to talk about Imam Bukhari himself, but due to time, the biography of Imam Bukhari you can find. The biography of Imam Bukhari you can easily find in many different lectures. So you can add notes there if you want. Today we are going to focus just on the book. We are just going to focus on the book. The first point is the name of the book. Okay, we're on page 30. Yeah? The first is the name of the book. Now, the name of the book, people generally know it as what? Sahih al-Bukhari. But that's more of a nickname. That's not the actual name of the book that Imam Bukhari gave to his book. The actual full name, I'll say in Arabic, then I'll explain what the words mean in English, is Al-Jami' Al-Jami' Al-Musnad Al-Musnad Al-Sahih Al-Sahih Al-Mukhtasar Al-Mukhtasar من حديث ومن حديث رسول الله رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم وسننه وسننه وأيامه وأيامه. I'll repeat it. الجامع المسند الصحيح المختصر من حديث رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم وسننه سننه وأيامه وأيامه. Okay. The first word, al-jami'. Al-jami' is a, generally, in front of the word jama', which means to compile, yeah? But in the hadith, when a book is called al-jami', then that is a book which comprises of 8 chapters or 8 topics, Meaning when we say al-jami', and it's important, I'm explaining this for a reason because it's going to come again when we talk about al-jami' al-Tirmidhi. We're going to talk about that over there as well. So a jami' is a book which has 8 topics. First, Aqidah. It doesn't necessarily have to be in this order, but I'm mentioning this order. Aqidah. So that's why you'll find generally maybe in Bukhari Muslim the first chapter would be regarding, like Sahih Muslim, the first book is Kitab al-Iman. So he mentions the hadith regarding Iman and so on. So Aqidah. And then Ahkam. Ahkam are the fiqhi rulings. What's halal, what's haram, salah, zakah, hajj, fasting, transactions, marriage, all of these rulings. And then Raqa'iq. Raqa'iq. Maybe we could say, heart softeners. Generally people translate it as heart softeners. And then Adab. And then Tafsir. So those are hadith that the person explained the meaning of some of the ayat. And then history, so regarding some of the battles and so on. And then trials and tribulations, fitna, and that also includes the signs of Yawm al-Qiyamah and so on. And the last is virtues, fada'il. So you'll have virtues of the prophets, virtues of the Sahaba, and so on. So you can see the different topics which are in the Jami'. And this is important for 2 reasons to know this. Firstly, because the word Jami' is going to come again. And secondly, because there's a big difference between Bukhari Muslim and the Sunan. Sunan has a different meaning, which we're going to get to in a little while. So when you mention it, it'll click and you'll realize why we mentioned all of these 8 different topics. And then he says, Al-Musnad. Al-Musnad here, remember we said Musnad has 2 meanings. The meaning of Imam Ahmad was on the ordering of the Sahaba. But Musnad here is referring to the first meaning. Meaning all of these ahadith that I mentioned, it has a full chain. They have the full chain, meaning, they're all connected. And then we have as-sahih, meaning they are all authentic. All of the hadith in here are authentic. And then al-mukhtasar means summarized. So as we mentioned, like Imam Ahmad, the amount of hadith that they actually knew were in the hundreds of thousands. But what they actually mentioned are only a little. And then min hadithi, from the hadith of Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, was sunani, and some of his sunnahs, sunnah acts that he would do, وَأَيَّامِهِ, and his days, meaning how he would spend his day, what he would do, and so on. Meaning, those are hadith regarding the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. The next issue is, what made Imam Bukhari write this book? Why did Imam Bukhari write this book? And there are three main reasons why he wrote this book. The first is that more weak ahadith were being spread. More weak ahadith were being spread from the people and also in some of the books. So some books they would gather hadith, many of those hadiths would be weak, and as time went on, the people had less knowledge of hadith, so they wouldn't be able to differentiate between what was authentic and what was not. So he saw that there's a problem. There's more weak hadith, people don't know what's weak and what's authentic, so he wanted to solve this problem. The second is that he was encouraged. He was encouraged by one of his teachers, Ishaq ibn Rahawayh, or it might be better to say Rahuya. The scholars of hadith would pronounce their name as Rahuya, and the scholars of Arabic language would pronounce it Rahawayh, because Rahuya is the way that they would pronounce it. So they heard it like that. But if you look at, according to the rulings of the Arabic language, it should be pronounced Rahawayh. So the muhaddithun pronounce it one way, and the scholars of language pronounce it a different way. What the majority of people use is Rahawayh. So we just write that. That's fine. So Ishaq ibn Rahawayh. So he was sat with his teacher, and his teacher basically said, how good would it be if somebody gathered all of the authentic hadith of the Prophet ﷺ? So, he was with Imam Bukhari, so that encouraged Imam Bukhari to basically gather this book. And the third reason is that Imam Bukhari saw a dream. Imam Bukhari saw a dream. Dream. And in this dream, there were flies, and the flies were approaching the Prophet ﷺ, and he was, pushing these flies away. So he was pushing the flies away from the Prophet ﷺ. And then the interpretation of this hadith was that he was defending the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. The interpretation of this hadith was that he was defending the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, and he understood from that he should write a book where he preserves the authentic hadith of the Prophet ﷺ. Okay, some of the methodology of this book, some methodological points of this book. Is firstly, he is ordered upon chapters, the chapters, similar to what we said in Imam Malik. So again, this shows the difference between how hadith was written in the 1st century and how hadith was written in the 2nd and 3rd century. The second is he had a condition of authenticity. His condition for every hadith was authenticity. And his conditions, he was more stricter than normal. Meaning, normally in Mustalah hadith you'll study that for a hadith to be authentic, there's 5 main conditions. Imam Bukhari added a few more conditions to that, meaning he was even more stricter. Okay? And he had especially one condition which is more stricter than Imam Muslim. Okay? Which I don't want to go into. The point being, he had conditions which are a bit more stricter than Imam Muslim. That's why generally Imam Bukhari is given precedence over Imam Muslim. That's one reason why. Another point is that he would not mention always the full hadith, but he would mention parts of the hadith. So he would mention the hadith in parts. And why would he do this? I'll mention two main reasons. The first is for extra benefit, for a certain benefit, whether in the text or in the chain itself, whether in the text or the chain. So maybe in the text there was slightly different wording. So one was with like a fa, the other was with a waw, or something, a slight difference. So in one place you would bring it with a certain wording, and in the other a different wording, so that due to the context, the ulama could extract different benefits. Or sometimes it was in the chain. Maybe there were different people in the chain, maybe there's a difference in how it is narrated. So that was one reason why he would bring only parts of the hadith. The topic of that chapter was a certain fiqhi ruling, and the hadith is long. The hadith talks about 10 different things. So then he would just put that one sentence which was needed for that chapter. As for the other sentences which are talking about different topics, he would leave them out because it's not needed for that chapter. There's not, and many people do that so many times. When a scholar narrates hadith, okay, they'll not necessarily, if they mention a ruling, they'll say because the Prophet ﷺ said this, and he will mention this one part of the hadith, and he doesn't necessarily mention. So, for example, if I said to you, the pillars of iman are 6, because the Prophet ﷺ, when he was asked by Jibreel, he said, "An tu'mina billahi wa malaikatihi," till the end, and first I mentioned the 6 pillars of iman. Now, I didn't mention the whole hadith. Jibreel came as a form of a man, and he asked the Prophet ﷺ questions, and because it's not needed. It's not needed. So that's the reason.
When it is said it is narration, so isn't it like invalidating the narration if he splits?
It doesn't really invalidate the narration, because he's not lying. He's saying the person said this and the person said it. So that's what he said. That's a part of what the Prophet said. He's just mentioning that which is most appropriate at that time, just like any person would do. And it's not really negating the hadith. We will get to Sahih Muslim. We'll talk about Sahih Muslim, and we'll see that there's a big difference between Bukhari and Muslim in this point, inshallah. And we'll talk about that, inshallah. Okay, the next methodological point, which is also very important and also a big difference between Bukhari and Muslim, is that it's called the fiqh of Imam Bukhari in his chapter headings. The fiqh of Imam al-Bukhari in his chapter headings. Meaning, the book of Imam Bukhari it's not only considered a hadith book, but many also consider it a fiqh book as well. So if you want to know what's the opinion of Imam Bukhari in a certain issue, if you go to that chapter, Imam Bukhari would write his chapter heading in a certain way where the ulama were able to extract that his fiqh ruling was this. Okay, and this is something that Imam Bukhari had that many of the other muhaddithun did not have. That's why Imam Bukhari is known as a muhaddith and a faqih at the same time. In fact, given the title Faqih al-Muhaddithin. He was the faqih from the muhaddithin. So he was also a faqih. His understanding of the science of fiqh was also a very high level. So his chapters, he would write in a certain way that the ulama later, we're going to mention some of the explanations, but the ulama came later on and they were able to extract, in this issue, the fiqhi opinion of Imam Bukhari was this because he wrote his chapter in this way, or because the chapter title was this, and the only hadith that he mentioned in that chapter were these type of hadith, that means his opinion is this, and so on. And it's something which, there's actually books on this. There's actually books on this as well. I believe the scholar from is in Pakistan, India, Sheikh Abdul Wakil al-Hashimi, the one who lives in Makkah. I think he's written a book on this as well. Just titled the Fiqh of Bukhari in his chapter headings. He's alive. He's in Makkah. He's from Pakistan or India? Anyone know? Pakistan? He's from Pakistan. Okay. So even he's written a book on this. Okay. So there's a few other points, but that's enough for the methodology of Imam Bukhari in his book. The only thing that we will mention is quick, before you move on to the next page, is quick one or two other points. The number of hadith in his book are approximately 7,560. But if you were to not count those hadith which were repeated, then it's 4,000. If you were to not count those hadith which were repeated, then it is 4,000. So with repetitions, 7,560. Without repetitions, 4,000. And there are many explanations of this book. The most famous explanation is Fath al-Bari. The most famous explanation is known as Fath al-Bari by Imam Ibn Hajar. By Imam Ibn Fath al-Bari by Imam Ibn Hajar. And this is, this book has such a high status in Islam generally, Fath al-Bari, that some ulama have even said, La hijrata ba'd al-Fath. There's no hijrah after Fath. This is actually a hadith for Prophet. So Fath in that hadith is referring to Fath Makkah, the conquest of Makkah. So Prophet said, there's no need for people to do hijrah anymore from Makkah to Medina because we've conquered Makkah now. So that's a hadith. So likewise, this Imam, I think might be Shawkani, but basically he said, La hijrata ba'd al-Fath, meaning after Fath al-Bari was written, there's no need for you to go to another explanation of Bukhari. You can stick to Fath al-Bari. Okay? That's how great this book is. So this is the main explanation of Fath al-Bari. There's also another person actually wrote a book called Explanation of Bukhari called Fath al-Bari as well. And this was actually somebody before Ibn Hajar, and it was actually Ibn Rajab. Ibn Rajab, he wrote a book, Fath al-Bari, explaining Sahih Bukhari. However, he passed away before he could complete it. So I think he only got towards the end of Kitab al-Salah. And you can find it, it's printed by Ibn Jawzi, I think 6 volumes. 6 volumes. So he didn't complete it. And some ulama have said that if he had completed it, it might have been better than Ibn Hajar. But the qadr of Allah, Allah decided for him not to finish that book. And there's a few other explanations, but I think we suffice with the main explanation of Bukhari, which is Fath al-Bari. Okay, in Sahih Muslim. So the next page, we go to Sahih Muslim. Okay. Now, Sahih Muslim. Again, we don't have time to talk about Imam Muslim, so we'll go straight into the book. The name of the book is Al-Musnad Al-Sahih Al-Mukhtasar من السنن بنقل العدل. Okay, this part might get a bit tricky. العدل عن. So basically you can put an if you want. العدل عن العدل again. The word العدل again. The word an again. If you don't know Arabic, then it's a bit confusing. If you know Arabic, it makes sense. العدل عن العدل عن رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم. When I explain it, it'll make sense, inshallah. So I'll say the Arabic again. المسند الصحيح المختصر من السنن بنقل العدل عن العدل عن رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم. So al-Musnad is the same meaning as Bukhari's. Full chain is connected. Al-Sahih means it's Sahih. Mukhtasar means that it is summarized. Binaqal, min al-Sunan, from the Sunnah. Binaqal, with the transmission. So the ba means with, and naqal. In Urdu, I think you have naqal. Yeah, so to transmit. I think it's slightly different in Urdu. Okay, but naqal means to transmit. Al-adl means somebody who is trustworthy. And an means on the authority of. The an in this context means on the authority of. And then al-adl again, somebody trustworthy. And then an again meaning on the authority of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Meaning it's a whole chain of narration which is authentic regarding the Sunnah from somebody who is trustworthy upon somebody who is trustworthy upon the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Meaning a trustworthy chain of narration. The
Musnad here is in which context?
The first meaning. The Muslim meaning full chain. Um, okay, why did he write this book? Why did he write this book? For two reasons. The first is the same as Imam Bukhari. The first is the same as Imam Bukhari. Due to him seeing weaker hadith being spread. Due to him seeing weaker hadith being spread. And the second is that his student asked him. His student asked him, and if I'm not mistaken, I think it's Abdul Rahman ibn Mahdi. He mentions it in the beginning of the introduction. He mentions it in the beginning of his introduction. Yeah. Yeah, his student asked him to write. He said, can you write a book which has the authentic hadith of the Prophet? I believe it was Abdul Rahman ibn Mahdi. I don't have it in front of me, but I believe it's Abdul Rahman ibn Mahdi. But it might be something you should double check. But he mentions it in the beginning of the introduction. The number of ahadith with repetitions, 8,000. And without repetition, 4,000. And Imam Muslim said, I have authored Al-Musnad As-Sahih. I have authored Al-Musnad As-Sahih, meaning this book that we're talking about. Because the first two words of the name is Al-Musnad As-Sahih. So that's why many of the ulama, if they don't call it Sahih Muslim, they call it Al-Musnad As-Sahih. Just mention the first two. He says, I have authored Al-Musnad As-Sahih from 300,000 hadith that I have heard. From 300,000 hadith that I have heard. Okay, some general points regarding the book. Okay, the first point, and it's very important you write it as I say it, is that Imam Muslim wrote his book in chapters. He wrote his book in chapters in terms of meaning, not wording. In terms of meaning, not wording. I'll explain it. In terms of meaning, not wording. What this means is that if you look at his book, it follows the topic. So he starts off with Tahara, or he starts with Kitab al-Iman, then he moves on to all of those regarding Tahara, Wudu, and so on. Then all of those regarding Salat. So he goes in topics, in chapters. However, he did not write any chapter headings in his book. So he didn't write the chapter of this, the chapter of this. That's why in terms of meaning, yes, it's structured in chapters. But in terms of actually writing the wording of the chapters, then he did not write the chapters. Okay, if you were to buy Sahih Muslim now, even the Arabic version, you would see chapter headings. So where have these chapters come from? Imam Muslim did not write it. Majority of them were taken from Imam al-Nawawi. We're going to get to that. The most famous explanation of Sahih Muslim is Al-Minhaj, which is written by Imam al-Nawawi. Imam al-Nawawi, when he explained this book, he added in the chapter headings. So that's why if you do buy Sahih Muslim, if you buy just the text, especially in Arabic, you'll generally find maybe between square brackets, you'll find the chapter headings. And the reason it's in square brackets is just to show that Imam Muslim didn't write this. But it's just for your ease, when you're researching, you can find the chapter heading easily, and you know what he's talking about. They've kept it in, but that's not actually from Imam Muslim. So that's regarding the chapters. Another thing that he did is that he wrote an introduction. Now this is something, different that he did, because majority of muhaddithun did not write an introduction. Imam Bukhari did not write an introduction. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, haddathana, and he started. So Imam Muslim was one of the first, if not the first, who actually wrote, one of the first, who wrote an introduction. In this introduction, he mentioned that his student asked him to compile this book, and then he talks about some of the general principles of hadith. But it's also important to mention, it's very important to mention that his introduction, he did not consider it part of his book. Meaning, the condition of all of those ahadith being authentic did not apply to his introduction. Meaning, if a hadith is narrated, and that hadith is in the introduction of Imam Muslim to his book, then it's not 100% authentic. It may be, but there are a few which are not authentic. So if you do remember, when I quoted, was it the statement of Ibn Sirin, in Hadha al-ilm din, and a few others, yeah? That this knowledge is your religion, and look at who you're taking the religion from. And also the hadith, it is enough of a lie for a person to narrate everything which he has heard and so on. So these, if you notice, when I said narrated by Muslims, I did not say narrated by or narrated in Sahih Muslim. I said narrated in the introduction of Sahih Muslim. That's very important to differentiate between the two, because there's a difference. If it's in Sahih Muslim, it's authentic, no problem. If it's in the introduction, then it may be authentic, but it may not also be authentic. So it's important to mention that point. Imam Muslim, he was very precise when it came to the hadith side of the book, meaning even small words like haddathana and akhbarana, he differentiated. Meaning if there were two same hadith and two narrations in one chain, the people said haddathana, and in another version they said akhbarana, he would differentiate and he would bring both of them. Because he saw that to be a difference. He saw if he said haddathana, that means the student read the hadith to the teacher. And if he said akhbarana, then the teacher just narrated the hadith to the student and the student wrote it down. So haddathana, student reads to the teacher, and akhbarana, the teacher reads to the student. And the last point which I want to mention, which is a big difference between Bukhari and Muslim, is that Imam Muslim, when he would, actually there's two main differences. Firstly, Imam Muslim would mention the whole hadith. So even if the chapter was talking about wudu, he would mention the whole hadith. So even if the beginning and the ending of the hadith had nothing to do with wudu, he would mention it. Whereas Imam Bukhari, what did he do? He just mentioned the part which was needed and appropriate for that chapter. And the second difference is that Imam Bukhari would just mention the hadith with one narration, chain of narration, and move on. Imam Muslim would mention about 3 different chains of the same hadith. So if there were 3 different chains, so for example, one hadith and one chain had, a few ulama in, and the other hadith had different ulama, and another chain had different ulama, he would mention all 3. And that's why now with these points that I've mentioned, the ulama do talk about which is better, Bukhari or Muslim. Which is better, Bukhari or Muslim. And there's some lines of poetry as well, I'm not going to mention. But the ulama generally say, if you want, they say Bukhari is better for a faqih. It's better for a faqih because of the fiqh aspect that we talked about. And Sahih Muslim is better for a muhaddith because he will bring the whole chain and he will be very precise within the chain itself, very precise, and he will bring all the different narrations. So his book was a bit more on the hadith aspect of his book focused more on the hadith. Now, and some of the explanations of this book, the main explanation is the explanation of Imam Nawawi. The main explanation is the explanation of Imam Nawawi called Al-Minhaj. Al-Minhaj fi Sharh Sahih Muslim ibn Hajjaj. Al-Minhaj regarding the explanation of Muslim ibn Hajjaj. Muslim's full name was Ibn Hajjaj. It's known as Al-Minhaj, or full name Al-Minhaj fi Sharh Sahih Muslim ibn Hajjaj. Al-Minhaj fi Sharh means explanation. Muslim ibn al-Hajjaj. And we didn't talk about Imam Muslim, we didn't talk about his life. But one thing I want you guys to find out is, how did Imam Muslim pass away? How did Imam Muslim die? How did he pass away? There's a nice story to it. So I want you guys to find out and tell me tomorrow, okay? Okay, now we have 4 books left, inshallah. Next 15 minutes we'll finish these 4 books, inshallah. Okay, I didn't want to go into the condition, but since you asked, Imam Bukhari, this is one condition. He had a few more conditions, but the difference between Muslim and Bukhari is that Imam Muslim, with all of the other conditions that they have to be trustworthy and all of that, one of the ones where they differed is Imam Muslim. His condition was that it has to be known that it was possible for the 2 narrators to have met. it is possible for the two narrators to have met. Meaning, if they're both from, let's say, in modern days time, if they're both from Kuwait, okay, it's possible that they could have met. It makes sense. But if one is from Kuwait and one the other person from England, and there's obviously no phones and everything, and we don't know that these people ever met, then how can we trust that? There's maybe there's a person missing that they heard from somebody else. It doesn't necessarily take away from their trustworthiness, but there could be a possibility that somebody else, and we don't know who that person is, and so on. So Imam Muslim, his condition is that there just has to be a possibility. Imam Bukhari, his is a bit higher, which is that it's not just a possibility, but it has to be. We have to know that they have met. We have to know that. So they have met. They have to have mentioned that from my teachers with this person, or any stories or incidents show that they have met. So and this is. They had this condition. He had this condition specifically for Sahih Bukhari, for this book. As for outside of this book, then he didn't have that condition. As you mentioned, Hadith to be authentic has 5 main conditions, which is studied in the books of Mustalah Hadith, which we don't want to mention right now. But the difference between the two in terms of why Bukhari might have been, what the ulama say it's a bit more authentic, is because this was one of the main differences in the conditions. Okay, now we have 12 minutes.
But Al-Bari and Al-Minhaj both are written by
Fath al-Bari and? لا Fath al-Bari written by Ibn Hajar. Al-Minhaj was written by Imam al-Nawawi. Imam al-Nawawi. And Ibn Hajar's book is quite long, all 15 volumes maybe. Al-Minhaj, I've got it in 6 volumes. It's a lot shorter. But it's known to be concise. It's known not, in the beginning, it's a little bit long. As the book goes on, Imam Nawawi makes it shorter and shorter. But his is known that without it being too long, it's got so many benefits, all types of benefits, hadith benefits, Arabic language benefits, usul al-fiqh benefits, and it's very, very beneficial. And in fact, when I studied it, of all the books of hadith, I would probably say that Al-Minhaj was my favorite. I enjoyed that one the most. Okay, Sunan Abi Dawud. Sunan Abi Dawud is the next. Actually, the page here, as you can see, this page, page number 32, the title is, what have the scholars said regarding Sahih Bukhari and Sahih Muslim? I've added this. This is something I translated a while back. And this is 1, 2, how many? 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 7 aqwal of the ulama regarding the status and the authenticity of Bukhari and Muslim. Sahih Bukhari and Muslim. And the reason I've mentioned this is just so that I wrote it out instead of making you write because I knew we wouldn't have time. So, you got lucky that we had less time, so you don't have to write it out. Huh? But I've also mentioned this to show the high status. And if you look at the names of these scholars, Imam Nawawi, Shaykh al-Islam, Imam al-Haramain, Ibn Khuzaymah, these are not normal scholars. These are the highest caliber of scholars, and they are all praising Bukhari and Muslim, and they are talking about how authentic Bukhari and Muslim is, and that there is no other book which is more authentic after the book of Allah except Bukhari and Muslim, and so on. All of these, I translated this at the time where there were some people who started criticizing Bukhari and Muslim. So one of my teachers, he sent me a number of aqwal and he asked me to translate it. So I decided to add it in. So this is for your information, that if anybody comes to you trying to bring you doubts regarding Bukhari and Muslim, you can show these aqwal. You probably don't even know what a musannaf includes or a musnad. What does that mean? It's simple things. This is considered quite simple in the science of hadith. Yet they want to attack the likes of Imam Bukhari. So these are just some of the aqwal of the ulama to further strengthen that point. Okay, Sunan Abi Dawud. Now, what's very important, which you should know regarding Sunan, what does a book which is known as a Sunan, what does that mean? So we had Al-Jami' had a meaning, Musannaf had a meaning, Musnad had a meaning. Sunan, maybe you're thinking, plural of Sunnah and so on. Yes, but that's not the intended meaning here. When a hadith book is known as Sunan, then what that basically means is those are hadith. It means that the book is ordered upon the chapters of fiqh. It means that the book is ordered upon the chapters of fiqh, ahkam, rulings. So for example, if you were to open Sunan Abi Dawud and Sunan Abi Dawud, An-Nasa'i and Ibn Majah, you won't find Kitab al-Iman in the beginning. You won't find a hadith regarding Aqidah. You will find Kitab al-Tahar. Straight away, those rulings pertaining to wudu and so on, then Salah, then Zakah. And then at the end of the book, they finish. So they don't talk about tafsir, they don't talk about Fada'il, they don't talk about history, and all of the other chapters that we talked about when it came to the word Jami'. So their books are more focused on the fiqh rulings, and especially Abu Dawud, especially Sunan Abi Dawud. So Imam Abu Dawud, he's got another book as well. I mean, all of these Imams have other books, but he's got one book. It's called Risalah ila Ahli Makkah, or something like that. A letter to the people of Makkah. So he's got a smaller book called A Letter to the People of Makkah. And the reason I'm mentioning this book is because in this book, the people of Makkah ask him about his book. They ask him about Sunan Abi Dawud. So when he writes this letter to them, within this book, he explains his methodology in there. He explains his methodology. So, like the previous books, I've said the methodology of this Imam is this, and that, and the methodology of Imam Muslim is this, and that. This was extracted from the scholars later on. But Imam Abu Dawud, he wrote his own book explaining his own methodology. Okay, so a lot of the points that I'm mentioning, he mentioned himself in that book. So, what he said is that he mentioned the most authentic ahadith he knows regarding each chapter. So when he came to the chapter of each specific fiqh ruling, he mentioned the most authentic ahadith that he knew regarding them. So he didn't mention all of the hadith, he mentioned the most authentic. And notice we didn't say he mentioned authentic, we said most authentic. Because there may be some chapters where in this certain issue there's no authentic hadith at all. There's no authentic hadith. But the most authentic hadith, which might be considered hasan or might be considered weak, but it's the most authentic, he mentioned that. And that there's benefit, and even if it's weak, if you have no hadith whatsoever and only hadith that you have is a weak hadith, then that's better than no hadith at all. That's better than you going to your own opinion, for example. Okay? And that's studying Usul al-Fiqh and so on. We might go, I think we'll go through it towards the end of Saturday. But the point being is that this is what he did. So he would mention the most authentic hadith that he knew regarding each chapter. Another thing that he did is that sometimes he would summarize a hadith. So if the hadith is really long, he would summarize it. And it is permissible for you to summarize a hadith, or even to narrate the hadith with meaning, with the condition that you fully understand the hadith, the meaning of the hadith, and you don't change the meaning. Okay? So, and that happens sometimes when you're speaking. You may not mention the hadith exactly word for word, but you give the general meaning. The ulama say that it's permissible with the condition that you truly understand the meaning. So obviously the like of these imams that we are talking about, they understood the meaning. So if the hadith, he didn't do it for every hadith, but if the hadith was really long, then he would mention that hadith. And that's why we come to the next point, which is that he intended to make the benefits easy for the people. So one of the main things that he wanted, and the reason he wrote this book, is to make it easy for the people. When it came to these fiqh rulings, it would be easy for them. And that's why he even said himself that he gathered he said himself all of, but we can say maybe the majority of those ahadith which a person needs for the fiqh rulings. So majority of the hadith that a person needs for the fiqh rulings can be found in Sunan Abi Dawud. Obviously, if it's in Bukhari and Muslim, people won't normally reference Abu Dawud. But otherwise, especially the fiqh issues, they are in Abu Dawud. Sorry? To fiqh rulings. No. And the last point which I want to mention is that if a hadith was weak, then he would mention that it is weak. So he would clarify that. Okay? So from this we can, from what I've mentioned, is that we can benefit that if somebody asks you, why did Imam Abu Dawud mention weak hadith in his book? 2 reasons. The first is because it was the most authentic from regarding that chapter. And the second is he mentions the weak hadith to clarify that it is weak. He would mention the weak hadith to show that it is weak. The first was because it was the most authentic regarding that ruling or regarding that chapter. I mean, there was no sahih, there was no authentic hadith regarding that chapter, but the most authentic was this weak hadith. And by the way, weak hadith themselves are of different levels. Okay, so there are some which are slightly weak, and then the other side you have those which are fabricated. Those which are fabricated he didn't mention. Majority of the time it was those that were a little bit weak.
So he will mention the weakness?
He would mention the weakness. He would mention it. No. Khatib al-Baghdadi, he said, Imam Abu Dawood, he wrote this book early on. Imam Abu Dawood wrote this book early on, and he showed it to Imam Ahmad. And he showed it to Imam Ahmad 3 times. A number of times. He showed it to Imam Ahmad a number of times, and Imam Ahmad liked it. So this shows, firstly, that from the teachers of Imam Abu Dawood was Imam Ahmad. And secondly, it also shows the importance of going back to your teacher. That even though Abu Dawood got to the stage of the Muhaddith, if you look at some of the aqwal of the ulama, I didn't mention, we didn't talk about him. You have some of the ulama saying, Ibrahim al-Harbi said, hadith became easy for Abu Dawood just as metal became easy for Dawood alayhi salam. Al-Hakim said, Abu Dawood was the imam of the people of hadith without any opposition. And other statements. Point being is Abu Dawood reached this such high level, but still he would go back to his seniors, he would go back to his teachers, and he would seek advice from them. Sorry? Yeah, like I mentioned the other day, Imam Ahmad even said once, I benefited more from you than you benefited from me. Okay, this last 2 points, we'll stop here. We'll take An-Nasa'i and Tirmidhi, we'll take them tomorrow, inshallah. But this last thing is the number of ahadith in Sunan Abi Dawood, 4,800. 4,800. And then the last thing, some of the explanations of Sunan Abi Dawood. I'll mention 2. The first is Ma'alim as-Sunan. Ma'alim as-Sunan by Al-Khattabi. And the second is Awn al-Ma'bud. And this is by Shams al-Haq al-Azim Abadi. Shams al-Haq al-Azim Abadi. And he passed away recently. He passed away maybe about 50 years ago or something. And you know where he was from? Shams al-Haq al-Azim al-Abadi. Maybe a subcontinent, I think somewhere from there, I'm not sure exactly where. Anyways, we'll stop here inshallah. And tomorrow we will carry on from Tirmidhi. And tomorrow is the last day. Tomorrow is the last day of this Dora. I don't know, Tirmidhi and Nisa Ibn Majah tomorrow inshallah. Okay? Tomorrow is the last day, but do remember that there is an exam. When exactly is the exam? If it's tomorrow or if it's later, we will let you know inshallah. We'll let you know. So prepare for tomorrow and then we'll see. Prepare for tomorrow and then we will see. I don't want anyone coming saying we didn't know. Huh? Okay. Subhanaka wa bihamdika la ilaha illa anta astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk.
Recording stopped.